Development Report, a conversation between the independent group of scientists and private sector representatives. My name is Astra Bonini. I'm a Senior Sustainable Development Officer with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And it's a pleasure to be here today with leaders in the private sector to discuss ways to get on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, this is a really important time for sharing ideas, as 2023 marks the midpoint of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda agreed in 2015 and the 17 accompanying Sustainable Development Goals. These address issues of global importance, as you know, from eradicating poverty and hunger to reducing inequality to ensuring decent work, healthcare, quality education, and access to water, sanitation for everyone, while striking a balance with nature, tackling climate change, protecting biodiversity, and keeping our fresh water and oceans clean. The midpoint on the 2030 Agenda will be marked by the SDG Summit this September during the United Nations General Assembly. The summit will be an opportunity, and in some ways, you might think a last chance to chart a new direction towards sustainability and equity. And for this, we're excited to have everyone engaged and mobilized. The forthcoming 2023 Global Sustainable Development Report will be an important instrument to inform the summit. The GSDR was requested by UN member states to provide a scientific basis to decision makers so that they can make informed decisions and support SDG progress. The first GSDR that was written by an independent group of scientists was put forward in 2019 at the SDG Summit. And this will be the second one, the 2023 GSDR, to be launched at the 2023 SDG Summit. The report is written by an independent group of scientists every 4 years. And this year, an advanced unedited version of the report will be released this month at the end of March, and the formal launch will then be taking place in September. So today, I'm very pleased to introduce one of the members of the independent group of scientists, Professor Noreen who will provide a sneak peek and overview of the key messages of the 2023 GSDR to hear from you from the private sector on your thoughts and how this could be useful in your work. Dr. Connie is a professor at the Graduate School of Media Governance, Keio University. Before joining Keio, he had tenure positions at Tokyo Institute of Technology and the University of Kitakyushu, and was a Marie Curie Incoming International Fellow of the European Commission and visiting professor at Sciences Po Paris. He also serves various committees and steering groups, including as Earth Commissioner at the Earth Commission of Global Common Alliances, SDGs Promotion Roundtable in the SDGs Promotion Headquarters with the Government of Japan, Local Government SDGs Promotion Evaluation and Study Group, Cabinet Office of the Government of Japan. And in the process of agreeing on the SDGs, he was the project leader of the Project on Sustainability Transformation Beyond 2015, a large transdisciplinary project involving hundreds of researchers to provide inputs into the SDG negotiation process. This was supported by the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. So Professor Connie has long been linked into the importance of science for sustainability and for achieving the SDGs from the beginning of the goals. And I know he's really making strong contributions to the GSDR and also to the process overall of strengthening the science policy interface to help attain the SDGs. Professor Connie, we are so pleased to have you with us here today. I'm going to give you the floor now, and then we will have other speakers afterward and then open the floor for questions. But in the meantime, over to you, Professor Connie. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Astra, for your very kind introduction. So as introduced, my name is Noreen Kane, one of the 15 members to prepare for the 2023 Global Sustainable Development Report. We are towards the final stage of making a draft of this important report now, and I'm hoping that we can get feedbacks from you, which can also be feeding into our report towards the final draft. So I'll start my presentation about how this Global Sustainable Development Report, we call it GSDR, is looked like at this stage. Next one, please. So I just want to start with a brief introduction of GSDR 2023. So this is an evidence base for SDG Summit, which takes place in every 4 years. And therefore, this GSDR is also published in every 4 years. The last one was published in 2019. This is expected to strengthen the interface between science and policy. As I'm going to touch upon later, now we think that this science policy interface should be enhanced and also include science policy society interface, which is going to be very, very important at this stage of international affairs. And this GSDR is expected to be an assessment of assessment. We have already gotten many assessment of global environmental status, global society status, also the economic status of what's going on in the current international affairs, including the governance dimensions. And we are trying to make assessment of those assessments in order to give you a more holistic idea about sustainable development. The member of our independent group of scientists, in total 15, and we very much looking forward to get your feedback, especially private sector is quite important in order to convene sustainability throughout the world. Next one, please. So a key message, key assumption is that we live in the Anthropocene age where human impacts dominate the planet. So we really are addressing the impact of the human species on how our planet functions. That includes the atmosphere, lands, freshwater, oceans, and finally biodiversity through all of these impacts. So we are focusing on various issues that relate to the Anthropocene. We also have witnessed many emerging crises throughout the world, starting with COVID-19 and natural disasters. And we are in the age of these crises, and we also are looking into those crises and how we could respond to those impacts. Next one, please. In GSDR 2023, we keep our focus on the integrated perspective of SDGs. That is one of the most important dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability per se, to avoid trade-offs and international spillovers. We also think it is important to address synergies between different SDGs so that our impact of our actions could be maximized. We also use theory of change that could help accelerate action at key phases. I'll talk more about this later. Next one, please. So the chapters look like this. We are currently working on 5 chapters. First one is evaluation of the current stage of sustainable development. Second chapter focuses on the future, and we are trying to frame the future. And the third one is a more important chapter to accelerate transformation to the SDGs. We focus on transformations that is necessary to achieve the SDGs. We are standing at the halfway through to achieve the goal because the SDG was made in 2015 and target year is 2030, and we are at the middle. So, and when we look at the current situation, there are many things that we have to do further. So transformation is very important, and accelerating transformation is the key to achieve the SDGs. Chapter 4 focuses on the science, policy, and society interface. And finally, we call to actions. Next one, please. In terms of the evaluation of what's happening at the global level, we see that the progress has been slowing down, unfortunately. And as you can see in this chart, the green lights are only limited to only a few SDG target, and others are in the yellow signal or even in the red signal. So this is a situation that we are facing. We also see the revised progress on several goals even. And also, we also see still negative trends on environment and inequality related goals. Goal number 1, goal number 2, also number 5, number 7, number 8, even number 11 or 14 and 15. We see many negative trends there too. And also in the current crisis, the conflict and climate change impact, as well as COVID impact, crises or scaring effects also accelerating this trend. Next one, please. And based on this evaluation of the current status, we are trying to frame the future. There is an ample room to both prepare for and shape the future up to 2030 and beyond. And planning for medium-term trends that will predictably affect prospects for the SDGs are quite important. We also see the warming climate. We are talking about 1.5 degree increase of temperature or even 2 degree increase of temperature. If we look at the current temperature increase, it's about 1 degree, which means that at least 0.5 degree or even 1 degree higher impact of climate change is that we have to accept in the future, which means that the impact of climate change will be increased in the years to come. So we have to prepare for that. Losses in nature and biodiversity is also quite serious, putting 50% of GDP at risk. We also see a digital transformation, and that could provide positive impact for climate change, for sustainable development, but also it could go negative to accelerate disparity between people on the planet. We also have to take into consideration the demographic change as well. Some countries are aging, and there are serious implications of economies and also to the nature as well. Growing economic inequalities is also part of a big problem that we are facing now. Next one, please. But we also see that broad awareness regarding sustainability issues, and we also understand that the SDG framework is robust. We also saw increasing commitments, partnerships, and institutional mechanisms in different parts of the world, but also see weak links with financing and budgeting in national and international framing as well. Also international cooperation when it comes to, for example, ODA. We also see the decrease of total budget of ODA. And we also see the accountability problems as well. Next one, please. So it is important to incorporate new scientific knowledge. We see that these interlinkages has growing attention, and also international spillovers as we saw in the case of COVID-19, also spillovers takes place both on the negative side, but also positive side as well. Scenario modeling is also making progress. So we are trying to incorporate new scientific knowledge into our new report. Next one, please. The framework that we have had since 2019 GSDR is look like as this. The report identified 4 levers for transformation, and there are 6 entry points for transformation that are identified here. We also, after intensive discussion among independent group and scientist members, this time that levers should include also capacity building. So we add that dimension here. So this is a basic framework that we are dealing with in order to make analysis on the sustainability issues. Next one, please. And we, as I said at the beginning, we think that it is quite important to accelerating actions towards transformation at this stage. A successful transformation can be considered in 3 phases. That is emergence, acceleration, and stabilization, as you can see in this chart. And we see that these different phases of transformation trace an S-curve, as you see here. The shape looks like S. The first emergence phase is when innovative ideas slowly give rise to new technologies and practices that operate in niches and on the fringe, often through experimentation and learning. During the second acceleration phase, these innovations gain momentum and reach tipping points beyond which they are widely shared and adapted. So acceleration phase is quite important in order to accelerate actions for transformation. And this acceleration phase is leading to rapid and growth. Finally, in the third stabilization phase, these technologies and practices become embedded in daily life as a new normal. S-curves work in both directions. The rise in innovative technologies and practices aligned with the SDGs would be mirrored by a decline in unsustainable technologies, institutions, and practices. This reverse S-curve has 3 corresponding phases as well: destabilization, breakdown, and phase out. So this is a model that we have employed to analyze the transformation. Next one, please. You can see several things already that are out there following this S-curve. I just show some examples here. One is a vaccine coverage. Another one is a share of electric vehicle. Especially if you look at the Norwegian case, the rapid growth of using electric vehicle in the past 5 years can be witnessed. Next one, please. And we also see that this transformation should be more integrated in different entry point for sustainable development, so that they have synergistic effect towards more sustainable future. So from a single S-curve to integrate SDG curves are necessary to be happening. Next one, please. And then we move on to the transformation through science and scientific input, and how science should be interacted with the society is addressed here. Next one, please. Here we think that science, policy, and society interface is quite important. For achieving sustainable development in the 21st century, the interactions will need to be multi-directional and multidisciplinarity. expanded to address complexity and interlinked challenges and goals. This requires an inclusive model of science policy society interface, as you can see here. Recognizing this, the international community has created platforms through which scientists, policymakers, including private sector policymakers, and knowledge brokers can interact and capitalize on the latest information. These platforms could include the Montreal Protocol for the ozone layer, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is called IPBES. Next one, please. So we think that transformation can be rooted in socially robust science, and socially robust science is considered to be very, very important, which incorporate social dimension of sustainability and the social actors and scientists working together from the beginning of scientific production to the end of delivery of scientific evidences. Next one, please. But we also see addressing global imbalance in research and development is important. Next one, please. Another important dimension is open science. Scientists shouldn't be stay in the closed door, but open science and the shift to open science can change how research is done, who is involved, and how it is valued. So science should also be open to the society so that more people can be informed or involved in the scientific process as well. Mobilizing knowledge to influence public policy, the education system, and public understanding is possible through open science, we think. Next one, please. When it comes to science and knowledge, trust and integrity is also very important. States, media outlets, and regulatory bodies should explore a global code of conduct that promotes integrity in public information facilitated by the United Nations. So we have to think about the fake news, existence of fake news, and it is time to better manage and regulate the digital commons as a global public good. Next one, please. In sum, socially robust science is quite important, and that may bridge the gap between policy commitment and policy implementation. Next one, please. And on this basis, we have a call to actions, and we have call to action in 5 themes. One is to establish an SDG transformation framework for accelerated action by next year. As many of you may know, that next year we have a future summit at General Assembly. So SDG transformation framework for accelerated action is necessary to secure a better future. We also call to action on how to build capacity of state and non-state stakeholders. And thirdly, we have a call to action on how to use levers in an integrated way to overcome impediments along the S-curve. And then we are identifying interventions that will capitalize on SDG synergies and minimize trade-offs and spillovers. And then we identify measures to accelerate impediments. Measures to accelerate implementation, not impediments, of course. Next one, please. So the first proposal we have made is an SDG transformation framework for accelerated action. And these should include components such as the ones listed here, set global priorities that guide national prioritization of SDG action. It is quite important, I think, also to set global priorities so that people's action could be facilitated to certain areas where synergistic action can be more promoted. We also need to analyze more on SDG interlinkages, and we should identify synergies, bottlenecks, and multilateral commitments as well. Next one, please. So I'm closing now my talk. So against the backdrop of the changes and shocks of the last few years, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development remains a strong and valid agenda for desirable future. And this is quite important. In the time of conflict, we still have a common agenda for future, which was agreed upon by all 193 member states of the United Nations. And this is a hope for the future. Making progress on the SDGs is an insurance, and building resilient system against new crises and shocks. We also should expect that similar kind of crisis is coming in the future. So SDGs are quite important in preparation for those negative impact to our societies as well. So I stop here and bring the microphone back to Astra, I think. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Noreen. I mean, that was a really so full of information, and I think probably many colleagues have questions and comments, and certainly nice to see things end on a hopeful note, despite the challenges the world is facing. I think the evidence in the report does point to what can be done and what could be done to transform the way societies operate in a sustainable and equitable direction, even in a short time period. So that's very, gives some optimism to the current climate, and I think it'll be nice to also hear from colleagues their responses to your presentation and the insights from the work that they're doing. I would just ask everyone to hold questions for a little bit longer. We will now have a panel of speakers from private sector leaders we're very pleased to have with us here today, and talking about how they're approaching the SDGs in their sectors, and how the GSDR could be useful to their work over the coming years. We'll then open the floor again to hear from participants and take questions for Professor Aklani and also the speakers. But I would now like to give the floor to my colleague from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Ms. Shivani Nair, who is Economic Affairs Officer in the Division for Sustainable Development Goals. And Shivani is going to moderate this session and then open the floor for Q&A. So Shivani, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Astra. Thank you, Professor Kanye, for that wonderful presentation. I would like to now begin the panel discussion with our distinguished panelists who are leaders from the private sector, and the GSDR can really benefit from finding synergies with their efforts and working together towards the SDGs. I will give the floor to each of the panelists to give a 1-minute introduction, and kindly stick to that time limit. And I would like to start with Ms. Noreen Kennedy, who is the Senior Vice President, Policy and Global Strategy, United States Council for International Business. Noreen, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. A big thank you to you and DESA for organizing this event and for inviting us, and also to Professor Kanye for a very clear and optimistic presentation. And also, if I may express my thanks to him and the other lead authors for putting together this latest Global Sustainability Development Report. So the United States Council for International Business, where I'm sitting, is in New York City. We're the only US business organization and NGO consultative status to ECOSOC. We had the privilege to be part of the discussions of developing the SDGs, so we feel very strong ownership. We're the proud American affiliate of the International Organization of Employers, of the International Chamber of Commerce, and the International, Business at the OECD. We are very pro SDGs and looking forward to bringing our ideas and contributions to the further development of this report. So thank you for listening to us, and also to delivering on the 2030 agenda and goals, looking ahead to SDG Summit and the Summit for the Future. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Christina Moral, who is the Senior Advisor, Climate Policies and International Alliances at Everdrola. Over to you, Christina, to introduce yourself in 1 minute.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting us for the presentation. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Christina Moral. I worked at the Climate Change and Alliances team at Everdrola. Everdrola is a global leader in renewable energies that is fully committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. More concretely, SDG 7, SDG 13, and SDG 17. We have incorporated the SDGs into our business strategy and our governance system at Everdrola, and we are very happy to be here and to share with you some views. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. Next, we have Mr. Silvano De Mart, External Advisor, International Organization of Employers. Over to you, Silvano.
Thank you so much, Shivani, for this opportunity. I would like to thank everyone at UNDESA for receiving us and creating the opportunity for this dialogue, Mr. Kenya and all the members of the International Group of Scientists. I am Silvano De Mart. I am an advisor for the International Organization of Employers, working on international private forums like UN Global Compact, B20 and B7. The goal of our organization is to represent the international business community in dialogue with governments and labor organizations. IOE promotes policy implementations based on sustainable development of business, and in the creation of decent work. For us, the achievement of the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development is a priority, and we are certain that the private sector has a fundamental role to play in this. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now we have Ms. Kathleen Everson Kuvutlu, Senior Sustainability Manager at Old Mutual Limited. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Shivani, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm Kathleen Everson Kuvutlu. I'm working with Old Mutual Limited, which is an insurance company based in South Africa. However, we also operate in 13 countries on the African continent. We are a very large asset owner and manager. In fact, I think if not the largest on the continent, and incredibly committed to the SDGs as well as sustainability more broadly. We've been thinking through these specifically with the risk lens, obviously being an insurance company. But I think even more now we're thinking around how do we start building resilience into our very business, our business operating model in ways that are more overt and clearly linked to SDGs. So thank you so much. Very pleased to be here.
Thank you. Now we have Ms. Marty McBride, who's the Director of Strategic Affairs at IFRS Foundation. Over to you, Marty.
Thank you very much, Shivani, and thank you very much to Professor Kani for the fabulous presentation. I really enjoyed that, and it's a pleasure to be here with the other speakers. So I'm Marty McBride. I'm the Director of Strategic Affairs at the IFRS Foundation. I used to be Managing Director at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, one of the global ESG standard setters that just over a year ago merged into the IFRS Foundation to create the International Sustainability Standards Board with the aim of harmonizing the number of reporting approaches around the world to help provide consistent information to capital markets on sustainability issues, to help mobilize capital faster to help achieve the SDGs, but also to allow capital to flow from the north to the south in a much more efficient manner through transparency means and more efficient markets. And it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Great. So as you can see, we have a really distinguished panel. There are some questions that we would like to pose to the panel. And then I'm going to request you to make your interventions in the reverse order from the one we used for the introductions. If it's okay, I think I'll just read out the questions. And these were shared with the panelists in advance. So we are looking forward to hearing their reactions. So the first question is, based on the presentation, are there any additional private sector priorities, challenges, and opportunities for SDG achievement that could be reflected in this report? Second question, from your experience in the private sector, what are some examples of scalable practical tools to accelerate transformations towards the SDGs that the independent group of scientists should be aware of? What high-impact initiatives and new ideas and commitments could turbocharge SDG delivery at the halfway point on the SDG agenda? And then the third question is, are there any additional concrete policy recommendations the report should incorporate to help the private sector work more cohesively with other actors, including government, civil society, science and academia, and youth, to contribute to the SDGs going forward? So with this, I will actually ask Marty now to respond to any of the questions or all of the questions as you would like. And you have the floor, Marty.
Thank you very much. Where to start? So much to say. So I think it's very clear a lot has been done over the last few years, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we need to ensure that we bring business and capital markets together on this one. It is essential that we get the financial flows moving in the right direction, providing the capital to transform business models into more sustainable ones. And to do this, it's really important that companies report on their sustainability-related performance, risks and opportunities to their investors. And in turn, we know, and I mentioned this briefly in my introduction, that investors can shift the trillions of US dollars in capital markets toward businesses that are part of the solution, the SDG solution. And we do know that it's estimated between $5 and $7 trillion a year needed to finance the SDG. So if we can get that capital moving to more sustainable outcomes faster by transparency, then it's a win-win for all and help us achieve our targets. So reporting and disclosure is absolutely an essential part of this transparency, and I think we need to make sure it's reflected in the findings of the report. We've seen a large number of initiatives in the reporting and disclosure space on environmental, climate change and social issues over the last 20 years, and it's helped. And they're all set up by very well-meaning companies and investors and NGOs and initiatives, but it's led to a bit of fragmentation, a reporting burden on companies not sure what to do, and really hasn't got to the scale that's needed. It hasn't been mandatory. It hasn't really been taken seriously. It hasn't really been robust enough to move serious money yet. So the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, was set up with the aim of harmonizing the investor reporting landscape to establish one single global baseline intended for mandatory adoption. So we need mandatory reporting. And this, as I said, was built on existing report frameworks and standards. And it's hopefully going to be adopted in a very similar way to our sister board, the International Accounting Standards Board's accounting standards were adopted that are now used in over 154 countries globally to help bring that real consistency across the way information is reported. And we know that investors want this, and we know business want increased, if I maybe I'll put it something, when we know business want a much simpler way to report and be able to have it much more cost effective and get rid of all of that confusion. So we do need one clear approach. So if I was to say anything, what we need is mandatory reporting across jurisdictions that can help move the capital in the right direction. And this also then needs to be enforced. So we've had lots of good voluntary, we've had a bit of mandatory, but it hasn't been enforced. So we also need it to be enforced as well. And to do that, I mean, it's practical. This is a really practical suggestion, action-orientated suggestion, but also we need capacity building, as was said in the presentation, of state and non-state actors to make this happen. We're quite accomplished on climate change and climate reporting. We're starting to do okay in biodiversity. We've got plenty of speakers on the panel today around labour rights, human rights, but we need to do even more on that in terms of disclosure and reporting as well. And we've got a really long way to go, and we have to go very, very fast if we're going to realise the benefits of reporting and disclosure for the SDGs. So I guess my call out, again, I'll say it, mandatory reporting and disclosure of the harmonised set of standards to form a global baseline. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. Yeah, it's really important to harmonize these standards of reporting by companies in different sectors and different regions. Thank you for that recommendation. Next, over to Kathleen, and please feel free to respond to all the questions or any of them.
Thank you so much. I think it's really great that I came after you, Marty, just in terms of discussing this, because I'm a sustainability practitioner and I really am working deep within the trenches in the corporate spaces that I have worked in, and starting to think through these things and how do we strategically link our sustainability strategy, which needs to be embedded in business operating models and not as an add-on. Like very often companies like to have a sustainability strategy that sits outside, that's an appendix. Actually, we need to, as practitioners, push really hard to have companies think through their business operating model. Is it in and of itself sustainable? How do we link it to sustainable outcomes more broadly, so that it's less heavy lifting for companies? Because when you walk into a board and you're saying to a board, we need to do something because it's the right thing to do, that's not what's going to shift the dial. What shifts the dial is if you're able to say, you're doing this anyway, how do we make it more sustainable in the ways in which we're doing it? How do we report that? So I think the first thing for me was really, how do we think about embedding our sustainability approaches within business operating models? If the operating models are inherently and only extractive and exploitative, then obviously those operating models need to be thought through again and shifted and changed. And then I think we need to, as businesses, start to strategically link then our impact areas, if you want to call it that, or our strategies to the SDGs that are material to our business. Because if they're immaterial to our business, I promise you nothing will happen. And I've also noticed that from a reporting perspective, companies like to, what I call SDG wash, I don't think it's a new term, where we're talking about all 17 SDGs. It's impossible for companies to kind of report on the basis of 17 SDGs. I think the fewer and more material, the more impactful you are, and then strategically link those targets and those indicators within your own operating model, so that you're able to then show progress. And I just want to also say that I sit on the board for the UNGC local network in South Africa, and was part of the process of doing the voluntary national reporting for 2019. What was interesting for me from a private sector point of view is that we're still trying to really get our heads around the SDGs within a South African context. I think what is great and what we do have working for us from a South African perspective is that the National Development Plan from it came out, I think, certainly came out before the SDGs, I think in 2014. And what's really great is that we're thinking through these things from a global perspective, being the kind of enabling constraints that have been created, the SDG framework, and how it links then to our National Development Plan, but more broadly also how it links to the Africa 2063 plan that was set by the African Union. So I do think that these linkages are crucial. And I think that businesses need to realize, and this is a sustainable practitioner's kind of plea, hitting my head against the wall, businesses need to realize, and I think are fast realizing, that they operate within a broader context. They need to understand that context. And I couldn't agree more with Marty around thinking through the reporting and really pushing for mandatory reporting, because I can promise you, no company wants to be the first to come out with your gender pay disclosures, specifically if they're skewed in the wrong direction, unless it's mandatory. And I saw that with a company that I was working in, not necessarily Old Mutual, who had other offices in the UK, where gender pay was mandatory for companies over a specific revenue, I think it was, or employee amount. And what was useful is to say that once you have to report on it and you're standardizing it and there's a level of consistency, I think that you'll start to see the tide shift within an organization. So that's just a sustainability practitioner's head.
Thank you. That's so interesting. This highlights the role of regulation to get some of these things done. Over to Silvano.
Thank you so much. It is a privilege to be part of this conversation. I think that we are going to end up with amazing insights in how to move forward in this agenda. As a representative from the International Employees Organization, I would like to stress out that we believe that the private sector has a fundamental role to play in the achievement of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Businesses are the main drivers of job creation, of innovation, and of growth. So this is why we are certain that to bring significant solutions to the challenge of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, the business community needs to work with cohesion with many other actors. This includes government, civil society, science and academia, and youth. Based on all the information that Professor Kanye presented on the table, we are on the brink of this midterm point to achieve this agenda, and we need to work in collaboration to achieve this. So this is why I would like to stress several contributions that the private sector can bring into this discussion. First of all, I think it's important to mention that businesses are the main generators of decent work and drivers of the transition to the formal economy. As we know, informality is a big obstacle when we try to tackle SDG number 1, which is no poverty goal. Workers that are out of the formal economy are vulnerable to lower income, and this means that they are less reachable by social protection systems. Following this line, sustainable businesses growth has a positively effect in the development of social protection systems. This means that in collaboration with governments, employers are major contributors to the development of these systems, and they can ensure that they are built in a sustainable way. Additionally, it is important to say that in the business ecosystem, micro, small, and medium enterprises account for the majority of businesses worldwide, and they are important contributors to the creations of jobs and global economic development. We know that according to latest World Bank states, SMEs represent about 90% of businesses and more than 50% of employment worldwide. I would like to highlight that in less developed countries, formal SMEs contributes up to 40% of national income. Aligned to all the red flags that Mr. Kanye presented on the presentation that he reviewed, I would like to bring some policy recommendations and highlights to the table that I think that can contribute to this discussion, and that are not only important when advocating for the achievements of SDGs, but they can also be strongly addressed and added into the report when we try to analyze the relevance of the private sector in this discussion. First of all, I would like to say that it's important to enable an environment for businesses to grow, thrive, and innovate. Businesses need to be enabled to grow sustainably. There are many legislative and administrative frameworks around the world that need to be reviewed in order to reduce barriers and to facilitate the participation of more workers in the formal economy. Business development policies must be aimed at SMEs and entrepreneurs ecosystem. This is very important when we are addressing the cases of less developed countries. In IOE, we are reviewing in the VNR process around 23 countries, and we understand that the relevance of SMEs, mainly in less developed countries, has a major role to play when we're trying to achieve the 2030 agenda, and it is important to address this in the report and to highlight extensively. Secondly, when we address education and employability, we know that there's an urgency for a flexible and updated skills development system. As we know, economies are experiencing a growing skills gap and a rising skills mismatch, and this is due to educational systems that have barely evolved in the last couple of decades. In this dialogue, I think that employers' organizations have an important role to play, and they can benefit the discussion by making sure that governance and curricula are relevant to current and future jobs, so their inputs and implementations are very relevant into this discussion. And this is another topic that I think, and we think in IOE, that the report could address. Additionally, while we talk about the development of business, it's important to address that the transition to formality and the development of sustainable social protection systems are fundamental into this discussion. There is a huge potential in business growth that if they grow sustainably and they also work in reducing the levels of unemployment and poverty, this brings a double effect when we're talking about how we can positively impact in the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Working together with governments, businesses can contribute to building sustainable social protection systems. And if these systems focus on health and education, this can bring powerful enablers to the achievement of SDGs. Finally, and most importantly, last but not least, I would like to say that fostering dialogue and partnerships between economic, political, and social actors is fundamental, and it's very important to include this in this discussion. based on all the previous recommendations and contributions that I mentioned, but also in all the topics that my colleagues brought into the two previous conversations, and I'm sure that it will be brought up in the next following ones. The private sector must be addressed as a relevant partner in the achievement of the sustainable development. And I would like to say that businesses don't only have the possibility, but we also have the will to be a team player on this mission. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
That's great. That's such a hopeful message. And next we have Christina. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I probably will repeat some of the things that Silvano and other colleagues mentioned. The main priority that I would like to highlight to accelerate the transformation and achieve the 2030 agenda for me is ambition to accelerate investments. Because we need investments to in sustainability, we need investments for green energy, for public-private collaboration, we need to invest in innovation, and we need to invest in education. And for that, it is essential to have enabling regulatory and policy frameworks that allow and support the acceleration of those investments in general, and in particular, that support the acceleration of green investments to develop renewable infrastructures, energy efficiency, energy solutions that are the basis to transform the energy model in order to achieve a decarbonized and sustainable economy, fully in line with the SDGs, with the Paris Agreement, and with the sustainability objectives. Precisely green investment, I would like to mention that, as you all know, is even more relevant this year because the global financial architecture is at the heart of the debate this year. And I also would like to make the connection with the 5-point plan that was presented by Antonio Guterres last May, that also included a point specifically on the need to triple the investment from private and for public sectors in renewable energies. We also need to invest in building robust public-private collaboration that was also mentioned. We need to build on the existing platforms, because we do have platforms like the Marrakesh partnerships, or that like the Just Transition partnerships that have been established in the last months. And I think it's also important to make the connection between the report and the recommendations with the recommendations that were made by the Integrity Matters report from the United Nations High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero Emissions Commitments for Non-State Actors that was delivered last COP in Egypt. I think there are important links to be made here, because we need to ensure that these recommendations are implemented. We need to invest, and that was said by Silvano and also by you, Professor. We need to invest in promoting research and innovation to develop sustainable solutions in order to successfully face the future challenges that we have ahead of us. And we need to invest in education in sustainability, education in climate action, education in energy transition, because we need to provide the grounds for mindset and behavioral change that we need in order to fully integrate sustainability in all our actions and behaviors. And I think we also need to reflect the importance of investing in providing current and future generations with the skill that the sustainable world that we want to go towards needs. Because this is fundamental to enable us to create jobs and to go all in line in this direction. For me, the most practical tool, and that was mentioned by Silvano and by some others, is to work together, to work on alliances, because this is how we will fully seize the synergies that Professor Kanye was referring to in his presentation. We need a reinforced cooperative approach to deliver the 2030 agenda. In this regard, for example, we at Everdrola, we work hand in hand with UN Global Compact, with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. We have an alliance with UNICEF to promote training and green job opportunities for vulnerable youth. And we have very recently, and since this was mentioned, I would like also to highlight this, joined the Paris Committee on Capacity Building Network, precisely to support capacity building actions. Wrapping up, regarding the recommendations question that Shivani raised, I think that we need a favorable environment to invest. We need stability. We need sound and predictable regulatory frameworks. We need clearly defined political objectives in the short, medium, and long term. And we need to make sure that the short, medium, and long term objectives are fully aligned among themselves and with the sustainable development goals. We also need effective tools to de-risk investment. And I think that we have to review maybe the definition of risk, because we have in order to achieve the 2030 agenda, we have to take into account the risks of leaving someone behind, the environmental and climate risks, of course, and we have to do all this by working together in partnerships and alliances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's so important to work together and to have these dialogues. And I think what we are doing today is a great example of, how this exchange of ideas can be so productive. And now we have Noreen. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I, when one is the last speaker, one always wonders whether all the important points will already have been made and whether one can bring something new to the table. And I'm happy to observe, first of all, that I can associate with really excellent points that have been made by previous speakers, all very important, but that I can bring something new to the table, even coming last. And I think the first point I would make, building off of Professor Kanye's excellent presentation, is that business is relevant to every one of the entry points and levers that the report is identifying. And when we refer to business, as I think Silvano said, we're not just talking about large companies, we're talking about micro and SMEs, but we're also talking about companies of every sector. And so I think there's a very big picture here represented by the business community that is already moving, but that could be further enlisted and further reflected in moving ahead. And it's quite timely, actually, this year that the HLPF and its cluster of SDGs is looking at the SDG 9, which concerns industry, innovation, and infrastructure. In any event, I'm going to talk about some things which, with humility, because it is already a very comprehensive draft report, some things that I think are missing or could be given further attention in the report. So apologies, Professor Kanye, for adding more work, possibly. So here are some things that I think would further enrich what is already an excellent report. I missed reference to the trade and the opportunities for synergy and implementation of SDGs that are possible through trade. As a business person, you can imagine that trade matters a lot. And it doesn't matter just a lot for the bottom line, it also matters a lot because it is a key enabling and delivery vehicle that contributes to job creation, that allows for efficiencies in the use of resources, that deploys innovation, including green innovation, and that spreads good practice. So Professor Kanye, if you could draw, or the other authors could draw a little bit more attention to the potential of trade to be a delivery vehicle for SDG action, I think that would be very helpful. And indeed, we know in the World Trade Organization and in UNEP and in other important forums that is already underway. A second point, if I may suggest with respect, I really appreciated at the end of your presentation the reference to resilience and how, if we are advancing the SDGs, we're really doing ourselves, an additional co-benefit by building resilience. But I would say that in the report itself, as I read it, I didn't see as much attention to resilience as I think is necessary. Transformation is clearly the road that we have to travel together, but I think at the same time, we must pay special attention to building resilience and adaptation, especially for the most vulnerable, especially for the least developed countries. Even in OECD countries, even in the United States, we are still recovering from the disruptions of different crises. And if we're struggling, then I can only imagine how challenging it is in other countries as well. And I think that the crises that we have been through and the point that you made at your presentation really highlights how important planning and partnership and preparation is across public and private sectors, so that we're ready to assist one another and collaborate, whether it's for sudden shocks to the system, whether they're environmental, health, or economic, or whether they're slower onset impacts. A third point I'd like to flag, and again, I commend your presentation and the draft report for its emphasis on innovation. I hope that you could perhaps give more attention to the full gamut of innovation, including institutional innovation. We fully agree that digitalization is absolutely critical and catalyzes so much positive opportunity and actual impact for the advancement of the SDGs. But I think there are other game-changing innovations that we know that could also be referenced. What's an example? And I don't want to take all the available time making the list, but for example, gene-based and mRNA-based health treatments, new forms of biotechnology, nature-based solutions. All of these could perhaps be in an annex or in some other appropriate way flagged along with digitalization, as important as that is. In your reference to the Science Policy Society interface, I wonder if you could add another specific branch to the tree that you had on your PowerPoint, which was a very nice image. And perhaps that branch would be on the Science Policy Business interface. You did reflect very well that so much science comes from private sector practitioners, but regrettably not enough of that science and innovation is still adequately visible and accessible, I think, to the multilateral system and to the broader societal community. IPBES is a great example of a multi-stakeholder, multi-expert model of a knowledge community. And I think there's a lot of potential to build other such knowledge communities that actually do bring the private sector in much more actively and build trust among the different actors. So that's another point. My second to last point has to do with the evidence base. And clearly science is a critical part of the evidence base, but so too is private sector data and tools for metrics. And I think it goes beyond reporting and disclosure, although those are really critical. And I want to support some of the previous speakers that referred to that. I mean, what's an example of such information? One of our member companies is LinkedIn, and I'm sure all of us have LinkedIn profiles. And LinkedIn has been doing some analysis of the profiles that reside in their platform and have begun to identify where green skills either are not adequate or are missing in certain jurisdictions or in certain sectors. And I think that's the kind of information that resides in the private sector that is a very valuable part of the evidence base, which I don't think has been fully tapped or is maybe even visible, for example, to the authors of this important report or to the UN system as a whole. Very last point I'll make, and that is with respect to investment and the point about incenting investment towards more sustainable directions. Indeed, I think that is a key priority, and especially with respect to infrastructure and development projects. And I think there is sometimes the tendency to go in a quantitative direction and add up numbers, which is of course very critical, but we shouldn't lose track of quality and distribution. of that finance and what comes along with that finance and investment. I mean, just again here, just a very quick example, and then I'll close. There is an initiative that is a multi-stakeholder initiative driven by a number of important countries, including the US and Japan, but also bringing in business organizations and the OECD, called the Blue Dot Network. And that initiative is looking not just to mobilize private sector investment towards necessary infrastructure development projects, but to do it in a way that meets high standards of social protection, of respect for human rights, as well as, of course, high standards of environmental practice. So I think, those kinds of efforts that, don't only bring money, which is necessary, but also bring with them the co-benefits and reach the people that are most needed and actually solve the problems are critical. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And again, very proud to be part of this audience, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So next we are going to take a question from the audience. And I think we are going to let the participant ask the question herself. So if she can be unmuted, please. Hi, Anya, please go ahead.
Hi there. I think I sent in my question just before we had Ms. Noreen give us some practical examples, but my question really was around the fact that we've heard a lot about regulation and how important it is to partner. I wondered if there were some examples of scalable tools that we might want to highlight to try and, maximize our efforts in the next half of this timeline to 2030. But Ms. Noreen did give a couple of good examples. So I wonder if anybody else on the panel has any additional to share. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, so the question is about practical tools and examples that the panel might want to suggest. I think Marty wanted to come in, and then after that, anyone else on the panel who wants to answer the question is welcome. Go ahead, Marty.
Thank you so much. And it truly is a great question, because disclosure and reporting is actually the very last thing you do, right? It's the story you tell about all the good work you've done beforehand to achieve the SDGs. Now, they might be drivers of action in themselves, and the fact that you all of a sudden, in line with SDG 5, need to start reporting on the gender pay gap or the number of men and women on your board, or in line with the SDG 13 on climate action, you might need to start thinking about decrease in emissions reductions, or water storage capacity, or frequency of risk disruption. These are actual, so by making the standards mandatory in themselves, you're actually driving loads of good action backwards. And I think sometimes we forget to say that when we talk about disclosure and reporting as just being, you'd have the best report in the world, but if we haven't taken any action towards achieving the SDGs and making our planet and businesses' planet more resilient overall, then we haven't really, reporting's just, who cares, right? It's really about the action that you take to get there, and it's why making standards mandatory as an important tool and lever can have much bigger impact. So, but on the how-to of the reporting, I'd like to talk back to Ms. Noreen's skills gap, the skills that are needed. I think the skills for the sustainability space more broadly, from everything from boardrooms right down to practitioners in the film, from measuring and managing some of these new areas, I think is probably one of the biggest challenges of the decade ahead.
Would anyone else like to answer this question? Okay. In that case, I have a question, and I'm going to propose that to the panel before handing back to Astra and Professor Kanye. Could you sum up with a one-sentence key message that highlights one thing that government should do so that the private sector's contribution to the SDGs can be exponentially increased? So just a quick one-sentence key message to highlight government actions. And again, I'll open this to the panel. Whoever wants to come in, please do. Looks like you guys have
I-
had your say. Go ahead, Silvano.
I would like to start. Thank you. I would like to say that it's fundamental to bring business to as many dialogue tables as possible, to focus on the potential of micro, small, and medium enterprises, and to empower less developed countries in a collective way.
If I may jump in, after Silvano, I think that the SDG transformation framework for accelerated action should have a specific and ongoing entry point and conversation with the business community. And as we talk about partnerships and what partnerships can bring to the table, whether it's private to private, private to public, or multi-stakeholder, these should not be parallel. These should be mainstreamed. The sense of urgency that the report and that Professor Kanye's presentation underscored means that we do have to think outside of the normal institutional box and find ways to bring the business community and other partners into the room where problems need to be solved and action needs to be accelerated. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
May I? So my one sentence.
Please.
So my one sentence is that we need enabling frameworks and conditions to allow and support the acceleration of investment, of the investments that we need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, in our case, for Everdrola, we need to accelerate clean energy investments, which are key to achieve SDG 7 and SDG 13. Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Professor Norichika Kanye, and if he would like to ask the panel any questions or respond in any way, over to you, Professor Norichika.
Thank you. Well, first of all, many thanks for your excellent thought about SDGs and achieving transformation towards sustainability. I took note many of things that you said, and it's really a rich conversation that we have here. And thank you so much. I think this is not the final remark, so I will save that to my final remark about the reflection of what you said. Quite important points. But one thing that if I can ask you about is that, going beyond standardization is the thing that you are tabled here. And it is, I think, quite important to have sort of predictable framework, and that could include regulatory framework or policy framework that can, make things predictable for business actors. But at the same time, we are in the time of crisis. So my question, well, and also before going to the question, well, what I think is in the beauty of the SDG is that it doesn't incorporate legal framework, but it only have the visions and goals and targets in a concrete manner without showing any rule-based approach. But based on this understanding, and based on what you said, that predictability is important, and also that we are in the age of crisis, what kind of legal sort of framework is necessary to facilitate actions? That's the kind of question that I have for you. because I think in time of having many important visions for the future, which are most likely to be embedded in SDGs and its target, I think rules has to follow and has to be transformed or changed in order to fit into achieving the visions. So some sort of adjustment is necessary, but that doesn't necessarily lead to predictability, I think. So in order to secure the predictability, what kind of legal adjustment or legal framework do you think is important to achieve sustainability in this age? So that's a kind of quite difficult question that I want to hear from I want to hear your thought about.
May I start? It is a very big question, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to give an entire answer, but I think there's at least two starting point considerations, and I think we've had this experience already with the development of the SDGs and their implementation. The first point is to, of course, make sure that governments are delivering on their commitments and that we have strong enforcement. I think one of the challenges continues to be in some countries that governments do not enforce their own laws. And I think that's imperative. And I think that's one factor that is holding back the fullest possible progress on SDGs. And it also contributes to uncertainty for business, and where there is clear and appropriate enforcement that would bring predictability and clarity. And then I think the second point I would flag is integrated approaches, systems thinking and systems doing. The UN has been successful in bringing together through the SDGs and the HLPF different internal parts of the UN that are responsible for different areas. And we're seeing more and more institutional cooperation also across the multilateral system, but maybe we need more of that at the national level. Some countries are successful in breaking down the silos in national governments, but others still have a ways to go. So those would be two suggestions, but I know that's only part of the potential solution to your very stimulating question. Thank you.
Can I take the floor now?
Please.
Thank you. Well, Noreen's approach was super interesting, and I will follow up on her insight of being such a broad question. It's difficult to bring a concrete answer, but I think this is an amazing opportunity for a brainstorming. And while Professor Kanye was addressing this question about the legal frameworks needed to achieve this agenda, I couldn't stop thinking about flexibility and adaptability. I think that the key role to understand, and we have the example of everything that the COVID-19 pandemic brought, is that legal frameworks need to understand how businesses and other actors need to rapidly adapt into unpredictable situations. And the idea of bringing up to the discussion that governments need to move forward in the adaptation of policy frameworks that bring adaptability and resilience for businesses and other actors into the scene, I think it's fundamental. So the answer might not be which specific policy, but how adaptable and how flexible policy frameworks need to be to adapt to these specific situations.
Any other panelists would like to jump in before we go to closing remarks? Okay, so again, I will hand over to Professor Kanye and to make closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your thought, and also responding to my question. That's really inspiring. Well, especially flexibility and adaptability is not something that we also focus so much on in our report. So that may be something that we should rethink about, as well as earlier comment made by Noreen about resilience and adaptation that we should mention more in the report. That's something that I should take home and think about in order to revising the chapters. Also, very rich conversation and other points are quite important that I received so many homeworks to think about. But I want to highlight, well, in addition to this predictability question, the importance of network. We haven't thought so much about mobilizing networks. You talked about UN Global Compact and their national chapters or WBCSD. We should really reach out to those potential partners to mobilize actions. And you raised so many important things, including investment, the space for collaboration between science and policy, and as you also mentioned, the science policy business partnership that should also be including in our thought about network. And that's also quite important point. And I think I should bring this issue back to IGS, Independent Group Scientist meeting, and elaborate more on how we can incorporate this idea into the upcoming report. So many other things are in my note, and I really appreciate your rich conversation, and I might get back to you eventually in the future for further discussion on each individual issues. But at this stage, I really thank you so much for your participation and your conversation in this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norchika, for making the presentation and engaging with our esteemed panel of speakers from the private sector. This has really been an incredibly fruitful discussion. It's really nice to have presentations and then discussion about practical ideas to move forward. And that's really kind of at the heart of the preparations for the SDG Summit, to see, what are the options for really accelerating these transformations and bringing this process up to speed very quickly, because the time is short and there are so many challenges. But this talk has really brought out how much potential there is from the private sector. And I think bringing the science community, an independent group of scientists together with leaders from the private sector is such a nice way to start building some of those synergies between different levers that can be used to bring about change. So this has really been an enlightening discussion and presentation. And thank you so much to everyone for joining. With that, I'll close the session, and we will hope to keep in touch with all of you moving forward towards September and the summit. Thank you so much. And thank you, Norchika, for joining.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice weekend.
Have a nice weekend.